What Nietzsche thinks is that genealogy for Nietzsche is just history done properly. He uses the German terms, genealogy in the case of genealogy and Geschichte in the case of history, he uses them interchangeably, right? And what he thinks is important to notice, right, is that it's a big mistake in certain domains, right, to assume that the present meaning or value of some practice or human activity can be projected back into its origin, right? In a way, it's a very Darwinian point, right? That is something, which had one function at the time that it first evolved may have a completely different function or no function at all, thousands of years later, right? Think of the appendix, right? The appendix presumably served an evolutionary function. Now it serves no function at all. What Nietzsche is critical of is histories of morality that assume that the present value or meaning of morality was always present if we go all the way back, right? And so he takes as his particular target a view that, morality is about, helping others. It's about altruism. And so that would explain the origin of morality. People saw that it was useful to valorize helping other people, and that's why that became our morality. And Nietzsche thinks, no, this is not good history, right? And it's not supported by the evidence, right? So in the case of of Christian morality, right, the first move he makes early in the genealogy is he says, look, let's look at the history, the etymology of terms for good and bad in the ancient languages, not just Greek and Latin, but he looks at a whole bunch of other books, Arabic, no, not Arabic, but ancient Celtic. He's got a whole bunch of examples, right? And he says what you notice all of a sudden, immediately about the terms good and bad, is that they are completely tied up with social class and hierarchy. The good are the nobles, the good are the rulers, the bad are the poor, the subjugated, the slaves, right? So good is the central concept. Good is who we, the dominant class, are. Bad is a kind of afterthought. It's sort of pathetic. It's sort of contemptible. And he says you can see this across all these different ancient languages, right? And of course, that looks nothing like how Christianity thinks about good and bad, or what Nietzsche says is the distinctive Christian contrast is good and evil, right? So in the ancient world, we don't have, as it were, the analog for the modern concept of evil, for Böse in German. Instead, it's gut und schlecht. That's good and bad in German. And that distinction is mirrored in the ancient languages, but it's a sort of class-based distinction, right? Now, what Nietzsche thinks is that over time, it sort of gets detached from class and comes to designate sort of, as he says, states of the soul, right? So there's such a thing as being a person of noble character, right? And again, if you think of the Homeric epics, right? The Homeric heroes are the good, right? They are the good ones, right? And the bad ones, the bad people, are the ones who are cowards, who won't take revenge, right? Who do shameful things. And the good ones are the ones who pursue glory, who take revenge on their enemies, who, are successful in battle, right? That's the essence of goodness, okay? And now, of course, you start to notice something, which is that the bad in the Homeric sense start to look a lot like the good in the Christian sense. The poor shall inherit the earth, right? The meek shall inherit the earth. Humility is a virtue, right? Poverty, chastity, humility, right? As Nietzsche calls them the three great pomp words of the ascetic ideal, which we'll come back to, right? Central Christian ideals, right? In the Homeric world, right, they're objects of contempt. You're a bad person if you're poor, chaste, and humble, right? Homeric heroes are not notable for their humility, right? So again, this is, so he uses the etymology, the words, as a first bit of evidence, a first clue, okay? But then the main argument in the first essay of the genealogy, he says, okay, so in the ancient world, the key distinction was good and bad. How did this turn into Christian morality, which looks like a kind of inversion of the Homeric good-bad distinction. And here Nietzsche appeals to a psychological mechanism. Right now, here we see Nietzsche as a speculative psychologist. He says there's a psychological state that he calls ressentiment. And he uses the German word. It's actually not the French word. It's the German word ressentiment. You never know that in English because it's always italicized as a foreign word. But in the German text, it's not italicized because it's German. It's related to the French word. As Rudiger Bittner has written, in German, it's got more of the connotation of a grudge. All right, so what's ressentiment? So ressentiment is kind of a feeling of wanting revenge, right? But not being able to do anything about it, right? So it's feeling like you want revenge on someone because they've harmed you, right? But you can't actually take revenge, right? And that's when he says ressentiment becomes dangerous, right? It starts to stew. It starts to build up in the psyche, right? So he calls Christian morality slave morality, famously or infamously. And of course, Christianity first triumphed among the slave populations in the Roman Empire, right? This is just a historical fact, right? But what Nietzsche's thinking is that those who are slaves, right, are harmed and oppressed in all kinds of ways. And the natural response to being harmed is to want revenge. Okay? Again, go back to your Homeric heroes, right? They're all about revenge. The big difference between them and the slaves in Nietzsche's story is that when Homeric heroes are wronged and they want revenge, they go out and get it. Okay. The slaves occasionally have an uprising, but mostly they just stew in their ressentiment. Right? They can't do anything about it. They can't act to do anything about it except for the occasional slave revolt, which is soon put down. Right? And so Nietzsche has the following psychological hypothesis. When people suffer from ressentiment, from this desire for revenge that you can't actually do anything about, it leads people to revalue values. It leads people to invert values, right? And the model of this, of course, is the famous Aesop's fable, right, about the fox and the grapes, right? So the fox sees grapes hanging from the tree and thinks they look delicious, right? I want to have those grapes. And then after a while realizes he can't get up the tree, he can't get them, right? And so now he's very frustrated. So he revalues them. He says they aren't worth having. They're sour, right? They're not worth having. And this, he says, is what slave morality does to the master morality, as he calls it, of the ancient Roman world. It says that the Romans, the Roman rulers are not the people we envy, right? It's not that we want to be like them. It's rather that they're evil. And we, the slaves, are the good ones. We who are meek, who are humble, who don't take revenge because we can't take revenge. We're the virtuous ones. Those people who think they're the good and the noble, no, they're not. They're the wicked. They're damned to hell for eternity, and so on. And, now here Nietzsche's helped by his, deep knowledge of the Bible, right? And of the history of Christianity. Christianity is full of a lot of expressions of, hatred, of pleasure in the revenge that God is going to exact upon, on the elites, right, when the time comes. And so he's got these great, quotes from early church fathers, who are just, you can see, salivating with pleasure at their picture of hell and the suffering that's going to be inflicted upon all these, these pagan elites of the Roman Empire. But again, it makes perfect sense if the origin of Christian morality is out of this impulse for revenge that couldn't be achieved in reality. So it manifested itself in a revaluation of values, as Nietzsche calls it. Right. So that's as it were, the first, bit of the story. How did Christian morality come into the world? It was motivated by the ressentiment of people who were powerless and oppressed. And it was a morality that, in Nietzsche's view, was in their interest, right? It's in the interest of the slaves if they can convince everyone that being a slave is the way to be and that being a Roman master is wicked and reprehensible. That's, in very crude form, the argument of the first essay of the Genealogy. The Genealogy has 3 essays, and it's important to realize Nietzsche identifies other mechanisms as well. Many people just focus on the first essay, the famous master and slave morality and raison du monde, but the second and third essays add to the psychological picture. And I'll just give you a sort of brief description of the sort of naturalistic argument. So the second essay, as it were, goes back to prehistory. If the first essay you can sort of identify with the eventual triumph of Christianity in the Roman Empire, right, which happens, starting a little before Christ, and is, of course, finalized by Constantinople's purely opportunistic conversion for political reasons in 300 something or other. The second essay is kind of back in prehistory, right? And the hypothesis of the second essay, it introduces a new psychological mechanism. And this is where Nietzsche talks most explicitly about the instinct or the drive for cruelty, right? And he thinks it's just a basic fact about human beings that they have a very powerful drive to do cruel things. And they take enormous pleasure in it, right? Which is clearer earlier on in human history. It's much more masked now, right? But, think of the Roman Forum. What was the classic form of entertainment on a weekend afternoon? It wasn't the gladiators, actually. Much more, though that was popular, but much more popular was they would release a whole bunch of African animals, hippos, giraffes, lions, some elephants into the arena, and then a bunch of gladiators would come out and slaughter them. Right? Now this makes factory farming, look downright, gentle by comparison. But this was the form of entertainment. And we're going to go and watch the, butchery of these animals, right? So Nietzsche knows his, ancient civilizations, and they have cruelty written all over them, but not just in antiquity, of course. So he thinks this is a basic fact about human beings, is they have this powerful instinct for cruelty. The problem is that you can't have a human society if people's instinct for cruelty is unchecked, right? That for human civilization to be possible, people have to restrain their cruelty. It has to be, restricted in some way. Because, as I like to say to students, and, when we're sitting in the seminar room, I said, it'd be very hard to have a seminar on Nietzsche if there were a serious risk of, people coming in, raping, pillaging, and cannibalizing us, right? That would make it difficult, okay? It'd be very difficult to put on an opera under those circumstances. So civilization has to put limits on the expression of cruelty. And now Nietzsche has a view, and Freud shares this view, actually, which is he's got a kind of hydraulic picture of the mind, right? So if you've got some psychic energy, if you've got a drive towards cruelty, okay, and it can't express it, it can't discharge itself outward, it doesn't just disappear, right? If you're going to push it in, it's got to go somewhere else. And so Nietzsche says, and this is the second pillar of modern morality, right, and of all moralities, actually, is that it involves an internalization of cruelty, right? That instead of being cruel to others, we direct a certain amount of cruelty to ourselves through the development of what he calls a bad conscience, of the ability to set up ideals about what we should be, how we should act, and then criticize ourselves for failure to live up to them. And the most dramatic form of that, of course, is the Christian doctrine of original sin, right? That is, by the way, you've got your thumb up arrow again. That is, in the Christian doctrine of original sin, you're guilty from the start, okay? You're guilty from the very start, and guilt is a painful emotion when genuinely experienced, right? And in Nietzsche's view, it's just internalized cruelty. Freud picks up this idea and it puts it at the center of civilization and its discontents, and about the internalization of, aggression or cruelty. No acknowledgement of Nietzsche, but he clearly got the ideas from Nietzsche. A big difference between Nietzsche and Freud is that Freud thinks the explanation of guilt is that it's just internalized aggression. And Nietzsche thinks, no, for bad conscience, when we internalize cruelty, we become capable of having a bad conscience about our actions. But bad conscience need not be guilty conscience, right? Think of the difference between feeling ashamed versus feeling, guilty, right? And I think that's roughly what Nietzsche has in mind. Something more is needed to explain why internalized cruelty produces the feelings of guilt. Right? And Nietzsche's answer, and this is the third essay and the third pillar of the genealogy, right, is that bad conscience turns into Christian guilt when it is attached to a very particular normative ideal that he calls the ascetic ideal. Ascetic means life denying, very loosely, but it means, he go back to something I mentioned earlier. Nietzsche says the three great pomp words of the ascetic ideal are chastity, poverty, humility. These are good things. These are virtues, right? But Nietzsche thinks people have sexual desires, right? They don't have any desire to be chaste. People have desire for glory and power and prestige, not for humility, right? And people desire wealth, right? Material gratifications. They don't desire poverty, right? So these are ascetic ideals. They are to deny things that people want by nature, Nietzsche thinks. Okay. So then the question becomes, why is the ascetic ideal successful with human beings? Right? Nietzsche says, the planet Earth seen from afar is the ascetic planet par excellence. Right? And what's he thinking of? Well, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism in a certain way, Judaism, Hinduism gets complicated, but there are elements of it there. They all have these very strong ascetic, life-denying dimensions to them, right? They all, to varying degrees, right? For example, they all stigmatize sexuality, right? They limit the proper forms of expression of it, right? They have, quite severe penalties attached to inappropriate expressions of sexuality. Okay. They're all ascetic religions. So Nietzsche's puzzle is, how did this happen? Right? And again, you look at the Homeric epics, right? You look at 6th century Greece. You look at, what Thucydides tells us about Athens, right, in the Peloponnesian War. None of these are societies dominated by the ascetic ideal. Okay? Far, far from it. Okay? So how did the ascetic ideal triumph? And that's the final sort of missing piece in the story about our contemporary morality, because our contemporary morality embodies this asceticism. And Nietzsche here now introduces a third psychological mechanism. He says every animal instinctively strives for conditions under which it can experience its maximum feeling of power. Right? This is sort of the psychological version of Nietzsche's idea of will to power, but I think it's the most important one for Nietzsche, that he thinks, just like there's an instinct for cruelty, there's this very powerful instinct to have a feeling of power. Okay? And now Nietzsche gives a very complicated psychological story that builds on this. What he says is that basically, here's the very simple version. For most people, the highest feeling of power they can have is not to give up on life altogether, right? To maintain the will to stay alive, right? And the argument for this, he says, is most people suffer by nature, right? That is, it's just, they... And, you can understand this in ways that are obviously true, right? Some people suffer from physical ailments, right? They're just born with them, right? But Nietzsche, and here he's influenced by Schopenhauer, thinks there's something about human psychology that guarantees suffering, right? We're endlessly in a state of desire. When we desire something, it's because there's something we want that we don't have, which is unpleasant. But the crazy thing about desire is even when you get what you want, you immediately have a new desire, right? So you're never, as it were, fully satisfied. The satisfactions are very temporary on this picture of psychology. So he thinks suffering is just built into the human condition, right? And he thinks suffering gives rise to ressentiment. Okay? That we learned that in the first essay, right? When the masters oppress the slaves suffer, and now they want revenge. They experience ressentiment. But if everybody suffers by nature to varying degrees, that means they're always experiencing ressentiment. And the thing about ressentiment is, as Nietzsche puts it, it needs a direction, okay? It needs an object on which it can discharge itself, because it's unbearable to suffer and not know why you suffer. As Nietzsche says at the end of the third essay, one of his most profound, I think, psychological insights, is that the problem for human beings is not suffering per se. Just look at human beings. They're very good at seeking out suffering. They're very good at doing things that produce suffering. The problem for human beings is meaningless suffering, right? Because meaningless suffering, you don't know who to blame for the suffering, right? That's what makes it, you don't know what really brought this about. Okay? Meaningless suffering, he says, is unbearable. You'd rather commit suicide than, endure meaningless suffering. So people suffer by nature. It gives rise to ressentiment. They need to know, why do I suffer? What's the meaning of my suffering? And this is the brilliance of Christianity in particular. Christianity tells people why they suffer. It says the reason you suffer is because God has laid before you this ideal of how to live, the ascetic ideal. It tells you that you should not covet your neighbor's wife. You should not want their property. You should prefer poverty, chastity, and humility to, riches and pride, and, sexual promiscuity. But everybody wants all these things they're not supposed to want, right? Everybody has these fundamental drives and desires for these things that Christianity says, like the Christian God says, are forbidden. Okay? And now you know why you suffer at last. You suffer because you're a goddamn sinner, right? That's the Christian explanation. Why are you so miserable? Right? Your suffering isn't meaningless. You suffer because you're a sinner, because you desire and want the very things that God says are not valuable, that are evil, that are wicked, right? And you want them, and that's why you suffer, because you're a sinner. And Nietzsche says this is, this is the great trick of the ascetic ideal. It seduces people back to life because it gives a meaning to their suffering. The meaning is a complete fiction, right? They don't suffer because of their sin. They suffer because of bad physiology, because of their psychology. Nietzsche doesn't very often acknowledge they suffer because of their social or economic circumstances, but that too, right? That's why they suffer. But Christianity says, no, you suffer because you're a sinner. And for that to be plausible, you have to believe in the ascetic ideal, right? But it has the effect of giving these people a feeling of power. They can hang on to life. They can't do much else, but they can hang on to life because at least they know why they're miserable. And of course, they're promised a redemption in another life, and so on. I've given you the kind of condensed summary of the argument of the genealogy, but notice, right, the goal is to give a fully naturalistic explanation in psychological terms of the origins of contemporary Judeo-Christian morality, right? Ressentiment plays a role in a particular historical period. Internalization and cruelty sets the stage. And then this desire for a feeling of power in the face of suffering, which gives rise to ressentiment. That's the whole complicated story we just told. That explains sort of why ascetic ideals should be so attractive to creatures like us, because it allows most people to achieve a feeling of power by making their suffering intelligible and meaningful to them, right? Even though it's a fake explanation, they don't know that. Phew, that's the three S's in the genealogy.